I've lived 70 years on this earth, and if 42 years in the United States Army taught me anything, it's that a man who makes a lot of noise is usually covering up a weakness. The loudest guy in the room is rarely the one holding the cards. Real strength doesn't shout. It sits quietly, observes the room, and waits for the right moment to act. My name is Arthur Miller. I live on 3 acres in the quiet countryside just outside Richmond, Virginia. My house is a modest wood frame place built back in the 50s. Behind the house sits a small workshop where I spend my mornings repairing small engines, lawnmowers, and tractors for my neighbors. In the afternoons, I tend to a patch of heritage tomatoes in the garden. I drive a 2008 Ford F-150 with a rusted rear quarter panel and over 200,000 miles on the odometer. I wear a faded canvas mechanic's jacket that smells like motor oil, cedar shavings, and cold coffee. To anyone driving past my gravel driveway, I'm just an old guy who spent his life turning wrenches and refusing to buy a new truck. And that suits me fine. Peaceful silence is something you learn to cherish after spending 3 decades in places where silence usually means an incoming mortar round. What my neighbors don't know, and what I've never felt the need to broadcast, is that before I retired, I served as a colonel in Army Special Operations. I commanded men in places most people only read about in history books. In a cedar chest at the foot of my bed, wrapped in oilcloth, lies a shadow box containing a Distinguished Service Cross and the blue ribbon of the Legion of Merit. But medals don't keep you warm at night, and they don't buy peace of mind. Honor isn't what you display on a wall. It's what you carry when nobody is looking. My son, Julian, is 38 years old. He is my only child. His mother passed away when he was 12, and I did the best I knew how to raise him alone between deployments. I loved him enough to give him everything I never had. I put him through a top-tier business school, covered his living expenses, and handed him a clean slate to build his future. Somewhere along the way, Julian mistook my quiet life for failure. Julian is the founder and CEO of Aerotech Defense, a tech startup trying to build autonomous drone logistics for commercial and military applications. He wears custom-tailored Navy suits, drives a German sports car he can barely afford, and speaks in high-flying corporate jargon about scaling assets and disruption. He lives in a world where a man's worth is measured entirely by the price of his watch and the floor number of his office. To Julian, I was an embarrassment. He saw my faded mechanic's jacket as proof of an unambitious life. He looked at my old Ford pickup and saw poverty. He believed I lived off a meager government pension and spent my days fixing lawnmowers because I had no other options. I never corrected him. I figured a father's job was to be the foundation beneath his child's feet, not the signpost boasting about the foundation's cost. Before I share what happened, please leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from today. And if you're new here, welcome to the channel. The trouble started on a humid Tuesday in early May. Julian called me around noon. He didn't ask how my knee was holding up or how the garden was doing. Julian only calls when he's performing or when he needs an audience. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying that practiced, fast-paced cadence he uses when he's trying to sound crucial. "I'm hosting the annual Aerotech Innovation Gala tonight at the Grand Regency downtown. Every major investor in the Mid-Atlantic Defense Corridor will be there. The board of the Defense Innovation Fund is making their appearance. We're in line for a $5 million federal growth grant." "That's big news, son," I said, leaning against my workbench, holding a grease-covered socket wrench. "I know how hard you've been working on that project." "Right," Julian cut in quickly. "Look, I need you to show up. The board likes seeing family values and ground-level stability. It plays well with the traditionalist investors, but listen to me carefully. Dad, wear something presentable. Leave the old truck in the rear parking structure where nobody can see it. And please, just keep the military stories to a minimum. Nobody wants to hear about 40 years ago. They care about artificial intelligence, not old motor pools." I sat in silence for a second, listening to the hum of the cooling fan on his end. The condescension in his voice wasn't new, but it had grown sharper over the past year. "I have a dark suit, Julian," I said evenly. "It still fits." "Great, body. Be there at 7 sharp, body. Don't be late, body." He hung up without waiting for an answer. I set the phone on the bench. I looked at my hands, calloused, lined with dark grease that never quite washes out of the knuckles, no matter how hard you scrub. Hands that had built shelters, cleared jammed rifles in the dark, and held a dying radio operator in the mountains of Tora Bora. I didn't get angry. Anger is an emotional impulse that wastes energy. Instead, I felt a familiar cold weight in my chest, a quiet realization that the boy I had raised had grown into a man who looked at his father and saw only a social liability. I went inside, showered, and shaved. I pulled my one dark suit from the back of the closet. It was clean, well kept, but admittedly 10 years out of style. Before I left, I stopped by the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. I didn't wear my medals. I didn't pin my miniature command crest to the lapel. But I reached into the velvet box and pulled out my old stainless steel military field watch, the one with the scratched bezel and the olive drab canvas strap that my team gave me when I stepped down from command. I buckled it onto my left wrist. I drove my F-150 downtown. As instructed, I parked in the lower basement level of the Grand Regency, away from the sleek, valeted luxury sedans lined up along the entrance. When I walked into the ballroom on the 14th floor, the room was blindingly. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, throwing light across 300 guests in tuxedos and designer evening gowns. Waiters in white jackets glided through the crowd with trays of champagne. At the far end of the room, a massive digital banner displayed the Aerotech logo above a gleaming prototype drone. Julian was standing near the main bar, surrounded by 3 men in high-end suits. His wife Victoria stood beside him, draped in a silk dress, holding a glass of wine. Victoria had always treated me with a cool, polite distance, the kind of politeness people reserve for a stray dog they hope won't come too close to the furniture. I walked over. "Good evening, Julian, Victoria." Julian turned Rista. His eyes swept over my suit, stopping for a brief second at my worn leather shoes and the canvas watch strap poking out from my cuff. A subtle tighten appeared around his mouth. "Dad," Julian said. His smile thinned into a tight, professional line. He didn't introduce me to the men standing with him. "You made it!" "Listen, the main tables near the stage are reserved for the Tier 1 venture partners and the Department of Defense delegates." He took my elbow, not warmly, but with the firm pressure of an usher steering an unwanted guest, and led me toward the far corner of the ballroom, right next to the heavy double doors leading to the service kitchen, where waiters pushed carts of dirty dishes back and forth, sat table 24. It was a small, round table covered in a plain white cloth, shoved up against a decorative pillar. "You'll be comfortable here," Julian said smoothly, stepping back. "It's a little quieter, less noise from the speakers." I looked at the table. It had 2 chairs. One was occupied by a pile of spare coat check tickets and an extra stack of printed event programs. "Table 24, I said, keeping my voice entirely flat. "Dad, please don't make a scene," Julian whispered, leaning in closer. His eyes flashed with sudden irritation. "This night is worth $5 million to my company. I have board members coming who manage billion-dollar portfolios. They don't need to be sitting next to an old retired mechanic who lives in the woods. Just sit here, have a meal, and let me do my job." He didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and walked back toward the center of the room, smoothing the front of his custom tuxedo jacket. I didn't sit down. I stood beside table 24, watching my son move through the room. I watched him laugh at jokes that weren't funny, nod deferentially to men with silver hair, and perform the role of a self-made titan of industry. He didn't know that the $300,000 credit line his company had used to survive its first winter didn't come from an angel investor network. It had come from a quiet personal guarantee backed by a private trust account at Virginia Commerce Bank, an account established 30 years ago under my name. He didn't know that the commercial lease on his research hangar in Hanover County was owned by an LLC managed by my former communications officer. He thought he had built everything on his own grit and intellect. He thought I was just the old man who fixed his lawnmower when the pull cord snapped. At precisely 8 o'clock, the heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung open. The low hum of 300 conversations died down. Security detail in crisp dark suits stepped inside first, clearing a wide path through the center aisle. Behind them walked a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark blue army dress uniform. 4 silver stars gleamed on each of his shoulder boards. His chest was covered in 3 rows of service ribbons, crowned by the Combat Infantryman badge. It was General Marcus Vance, chairman of the Defense Innovation Thruway Board, the man holding the pen for the $5 million federal grant. Julian's face lit up with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. He quickly adjusted his cuffs, motioned for Victoria to follow him, and began marching briskly down the center aisle, his hand outstretched to greet the most powerful military official in the room. "General Vance!" Julian called out, his voice ringing with practiced warmth. "Welcome to the Aerotech Gala. It's an absolute honor to have you tonight, sir. On behalf of our executive team..." General Vance didn't stop Aron. He didn't look at Julian Aron. He didn't even acknowledge the hand Julian had extended in front of him. The 4-star general walked straight past my son as if he were made of glass. His sharp, disciplined eyes scanned the perimeter of the room, sweeping past the VIP tables, past the stage, past the gleaming drone prototype, until his gaze locked onto the dark, shaded corner near the kitchen doors. Locked directly onto table 24. If you've ever watched a room full of powerful people lose their breath all at once, you know how heavy real silence can feel. It isn't the kind of quiet that happens when a speaker steps up to a microphone. It's the kind that settles over a hall when a sudden, undeniable truth enters the room, and nobody knows where to look. The ballroom at the Grand Regency became completely still. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped. The quiet hum of 300 high-stakes conversations died in an instant. General Marcus Vance took 4 deliberate steps past Julian Wana. He didn't glance back. He didn't offer a polite nod. He simply walked straight down the narrow aisle between the round tables, his polished leather boots clicking against the parquet floor with absolute rhythm. Julian stood frozen in the center of the main walkway, his hands still extended in midair where the general had left it. His face was a mixture of total confusion and rising panic. Beside him, Victoria swallowed hard, her hand clutching her silk purse so tightly her knuckles turned pale. General Vance stopped 3 feet in front of me. He didn't look at table 24. He didn't look at the stack of spare coat check tickets or the kitchen doors swinging behind my shoulder. He looked directly into my eyes. His jaw set, his shoulders squared, and before anyone in that room could process what was happening, the 4-star general raised his right hand to the brim of his dress cap and delivered a crisp, flawless military salute. "Good evening, Colonel Miller," General Vance said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the dead quiet room like a bell. "It's been too long, sir." I didn't smile. I didn't posture. I simply stood up straight, brought my right hand up, and returned the salute with the exact discipline I'd practiced for 42 years. "At ease. Marcus," I said softly, lowering my hand, "you're making a scene." A faint, respectful smile touched the corner of the general's mouth. "With all due respect, Colonel, you're the one sitting next to the dish carts. That's a scene I intend to correct immediately. Behind us." Julian finally moved to Stama. He stumbled forward 2 steps, his voice high and strained as he tried to regain control of a room that was rapidly slipping through his fingers. "General Vance," Julian blurted out, stepping between us with a forced, breathless laugh. I apologize for the confusion. There's clearly been a misunderstanding. This is just my father. He's a retired mechanic. He was just filling a seat near the back. Let me show you to the head table. We have the Department of Defense delegates waiting for you." General Vance turned his head slowly. He looked at Julian not with anger, but with the cold, assessing gaze an experienced commander uses when looking at a green recruit who has just made a critical error on the field. "I know who he is. Mr. Miller," General Vance said, his tone dropping an octave into pure, unyielding steel. "The question is whether you have any idea who he is." Julian blinked, his mouth opening and closing without making a sound. The general turned back toward the room, addressing the senior military officers and board members who had followed him inside. 22 years ago, during the second push in the Shai-Kot Valley, my command element was pinned down under heavy mortar fire. We were outnumbered, cut off from communications, and taking casualties by the minute. It was Colonel Arthur Miller who organized the extraction, led a 4-man team through 3 miles of hostile terrain, and personally pulled 7 wounded men out of a burning command vehicle before the fuel cell detonated. The general paused, letting the words sink into the silent ballroom. "I was one of those 7 men," General Vance continued smoothly. "Colonel Miller served as the commander of the 3rd Special Forces Group. He holds the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and the Legion of Merit. He is the reason I am standing here tonight wearing these stars." A low murmur rippled through the 300 guests. I watched the faces of the venture capitalists and defense contractors at the front tables. The condescension that had filled the room 10 minutes earlier evaporated, replaced by an unmistakable, heavy respect. Julian's face had gone completely white. He turned slowly to look at me, staring at my worn suit, my calloused hands, and the simple field watch on my wrist as if he were seeing me for the very first time in his life. "Dad?" Julian whispered, his voice cracking. You never told me you were a colonel. You said you were in logistics." "I was in command." "Julian," I said, keeping my tone completely even. "Command is logistics. It's making sure the men under your care have what they need to survive, and making sure you don't take credit for the blood they spill. I didn't build my life around titles, and I certainly didn't raise you to measure a man by his coat." Victoria stepped back, ducking her head to avoid the eyes of the women sitting at the surrounding tables. The social status she had worked so hard to cultivate over the past 5 years had just turned into a public embarrassment. General Vance reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather-bound folder bearing the gold crest of the Department of Defense. He didn't hand it to Julian. He set it squarely on table 24, right on top of the pile of spare coat check tickets. "Mr. General Miller," the general said, looking directly at my son, "the Defense Innovation Fund evaluates companies based on 3 criteria: technological viability, operational scalability, and character. We do not invest taxpayer capital into organizations led by individuals who treat service, sacrifice, and family with public contempt." Julian reached out a trembling hand toward the folder. "General, please, we've spent 18 months on this prototype. The technology is sound. Our board..." The evaluation process for Aerotech's $5 million grant is suspended indefinitely. General Vance interrupted cleanly. "Effective immediately. A formal ethics review will be conducted by the Thruway Board on Monday morning." The announcement hit the room like a physical blow. Several board members from Aerotech who were sitting at table 1 immediately stood up from their seats, their faces tight with fury as they stared at Julian. In the world of tech startups, a suspended federal grant isn't just a delay, it's a death sentence for investor confidence. "General, you can't do this," Julian pleaded, his composure completely shattering. We have payroll. We have vendor commitments. If this grant is frozen, our credit line— Your credit line, I cut in quietly, stepping forward, is another matter entirely. Julian turned back to me, his eyes wide with desperate hope. Dad, please, talk to him. Tell him who I am. Tell him how hard I've worked for this. I looked at my son. Really looked at him. I saw the 38-year-old man who had spent his adult life running away from the quiet integrity of the home he grew up in, chasing the applause of men who wouldn't remember his name if his bank account dried up tomorrow. I know exactly who you are. Julian, I said softly. And that's why we need to talk about Virginia Commerce Bank. There is a moment when a man who has built his entire life on appearances realizes that the floor beneath him isn't made of solid oak, but thin ice over deep water. Julian stared at me, his eyes darting frantically between my face and General Vance, who stood 3 feet away like an unyielding granite wall. Virginia Commerce Bank, Julian repeated, his voice cracking into a thin, breathless whisper. Dad, what are you talking about? My credit line is through First National. First National manages the account. Julian, I said, keeping my hands resting lightly at my sides. But First National doesn't extend a $1.2 million revolving line to a 4-year-old tech startup with 0 liquid reserves without institutional collateral. That collateral didn't come from your venture partners. It came from the Miller Family Trust, a private account backed by the land beneath my house and 40 years of military pension reserves. The silence in the ballroom deepened. The venture capitalists sitting at table 1 exchanged sharp, alarmed glances. The chief financial officer of Aerotech, a young man who had been sipping scotch and boasting about quarterly projections 5 minutes earlier, suddenly set his glass down so hard the amber liquid sloshed over the rim. You vascular do-3-0! You backed the credit line, Julian stammered, taking a step backward. I signed the personal guarantee 3 years ago when you were 2 weeks away from missing payroll, I said quietly. I didn't do it so you could buy a European sports car or rent a penthouse apartment on the river. I did it because I believed in your work, and I believed that beneath the expensive suits, you were still the boy who understood the value of an honest day's labor. Victoria stepped up beside Julian, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched his arm. Arthur, she began, her tone shifting instantly from cool indifference to a desperate, syrupy pleading. Arthur, please. You can't talk about business matters here. This is Julian's big night. We can sit down tomorrow. We can have dinner at the house, just family. Victoria, I interrupted, looking her squarely in the eye. For 3 years, I've sat at your Thanksgiving table while you passed me the bread basket and asked if I needed help reading the menu because you assumed a retired mechanic couldn't understand modern technology. You don't owe me dinner, and I don't owe you my silence. General Vance didn't say a word. He simply stood beside me, his 4 stars catching the light of the crystal chandeliers, providing the silent, formidable authority that allowed my words to settle into the room like heavy artillery. Julian looked around the room, finally noticing the 100 pairs of eyes fixed on him, investors, clients, board members, and city officials. The grand image he had spent half a decade constructing was dissolving in real time. Dad? Julian whispered, stepping closer, his voice dropping into a desperate plea. If you pull that guarantee, the bank will freeze our operating accounts by Monday morning. We won't be able to process vendor payments. The lease on the Hanover Research Facility will go into default. You'll destroy everything I've built. You didn't build it. Julian, I replied, my voice steady, carrying that cold, disciplined clarity that had carried me through 2 combat tours. You assembled a cardboard facade and asked other people to pay for the foundation. You wanted to live like a self-made titan while using an old soldier's quiet sacrifice as your safety net. I reached into my inner jacket pocket. I didn't pull out a dramatic legal order or a flash drive. I pulled out a small, simple fountain pen, the same pen I had used to sign Julian's birth certificate 38 years ago. At 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, my attorney, Mr. Bill Garrett, will deliver a formal revocation of my personal guarantee to Virginia Commerce Bank. I said, without that guarantee, First National will call the outstanding principal balance. How you manage your debt, your payroll, and your investors from this moment forward is entirely up to you. Dad? No, please. Julian reached out, grabbing my forearm. You're my father. You're supposed to support me. I looked down at his hand on my sleeve, then looked up into his panicked, pleading eyes. A father's job is to protect his child from destruction. Julian, I said softly. And right now, the only thing destroying you is your own arrogance. Continuing to shield you from the consequences of your choices isn't love. It's enabling. I gently disengaged his grip from my arm. General Vance stepped forward, placing a firm, heavy hand on my shoulder. Colonel, the general said respectfully, my detail has a car waiting at the side entrance. I think you've completed your duties here tonight. Thank you. Marcus, I said. I turned my back on table 24. I turned my back on the stage, the prototype drone, the $300 a plate dinners, and the room full of people who had judged a man by the grease on his knuckles and the age of his coat. As I walked down the center aisle beside General Vance, the crowd parted cleanly. No one made a sound. Executives bowed their heads slightly as I passed. Young junior officers standing near the back wall snapped to attention. Behind me, I could hear Julian's voice rising in a frantic, cracking pitch as his lead investor cornered him near the stage. Julian, what the hell is First National going to do on Monday? Is this company liquid or not? I didn't turn around. I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom and stepped out into the cool, quiet hallway. 10 minutes later, I was back in the basement parking structure. The air smelled of concrete, exhaust, and cold night rain. My old 2008 Ford F-150 sat parked under a flickering fluorescent light, looking completely out of place among the row of glossy luxury sedans. I unlocked the door, climbed into the driver's seat, and set my worn leather shoes against the floor mats. I reached down and touched the canvas strap of my old field watch. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. I turned the key in the ignition. The V8 engine roared to life with that familiar, steady rumble I associated with the sound of freedom. I eased back onto the road, the engines for 16 years. I pulled out of the parking structure and drove onto the quiet, rain-slicked streets of Richmond, heading back toward the countryside, toward my workshop, and toward the quiet dignity that no amount of money could ever buy. Some men spend their entire lives measuring the strength of a building by the shine of its paint. They look at marble floors, glass walls, and custom suits, and they assume those things will hold when the wind starts blowing. But any engineer or any soldier knows the truth: paint doesn't bear weight. Foundations do. By Monday morning, the storm hit Aerotech Defense with the cold, unyielding force of a freight train. First National Bank didn't wait for business hours to wrap up. At precisely 8:15, Mr. Bill Garrett delivered the formal revocation of my personal guarantee directly to the bank's legal division. By 9:30, Aerotech's operating accounts were frozen pending a full debt restructuring audit. The $1.2 million revolving line of credit that Julian had treated like his personal piggy bank was officially revoked. By noon, news of the suspended $5 million federal grant from the Defense Innovation Fund had leaked to the tech industry press. The board members who had stood at Table 1 on Saturday night calling Julian a visionary were the same men who voted unanimously to remove him as chief executive officer before 3 o'clock on Monday afternoon. The house of cards didn't collapse because I pushed it. It collapsed because the wind finally blew, and there was nothing holding it up. It was late Thursday evening when the headlights of a sedan turned down my gravel driveway. I was sitting on the back porch, cleaning the air filter from my riding mower by the light of a single yellow bug lamp. The rain had cleared 2 days ago, leaving the Virginia air cool and crisp, carrying the dark, rich scent of damp earth and turned soil from my garden. I heard the car door close. The footsteps coming around the side of the house were slow, heavy, and hesitant. Julian stepped into the light of the porch. He wasn't wearing his tailored navy suit. He wore a rumpled linen shirt, no tie, and dark jeans. His hair was messy, and the sharp, arrogant confidence that had defined his posture for 10 years looked completely drained away. Behind him, parked near my old F-150, was a rented sedan. The German sports car had already been surrendered back to the dealership lease program. He stood at the bottom of the wooden steps, looking up at me. "Dad?" he said softly. His voice lacked the fast-paced, corporate edge it usually carried. It sounded tired. It sounded like the voice of a teenager who had just realized he was lost in the dark. "Evening, Julian," I said, setting the air filter on the workbench and wiping my hands on an old shop rag. "Coffee's inside if you want a cup." He didn't move toward the door. He stepped up onto the lower stair, resting his hand against the porch railing. "The board voted me out," he said quietly, looking down at his shoes. "The bank called the principal balance on the line. Victoria took her things and moved back to her parents' house in Charlottesville on Tuesday." I pulled out a wooden chair and sat down, resting my arms on my knees. I didn't interrupt. I didn't offer a quick reassurance, and I certainly didn't kick him while he was down. Discipline isn't about cruelty. It's about letting the truth sit in the room until a man is ready to face it. "I spent 5 years trying to prove I was better than this place," Julian whispered, his voice cracking as he gestured vaguely toward the workshop, the old truck, and the dark garden. "I thought if I made enough noise, if I sat at the head table, if I had the right title, nobody would ever look at me and see a mechanic's kid." He looked up at me, his eyes wet in the dim yellow light. "I didn't know about the trust, Dad. I didn't know you backed the bank. I didn't know about the grant board or General Vance. Why didn't you ever tell me?" I looked at my son, really looked at him. "If I had told you, Julian," I said gently, "you would have used my name to buy another suit. You would have used my service as a badge to win another contract. You wouldn't have respected the work. You would have just traded on the reputation." I stood up, walked to the edge of the porch, and looked out over the 3 acres of land I'd worked for 30 years. "When you were 12 years old," I continued, "after your mother died, I brought you out to this yard to build the tool shed behind the garage. Do you remember that?" Julian wiped his face with the back of his wrist and nodded once. "I remember." "You wanted to put the roof on first," I said softly. "You wanted to see the shingles go up because you thought that was what made it look like a building. I had to pull you off the ladder 3 times to make sure we dug the footings 2 feet into the clay and poured the concrete level." I turned back to face him. "A man's character is those footings. Julian Inta. You wanted the roof before you had the dirt dug out. Inta. You wanted the applause before you did the labor. Inta. I paid off your credit line 3 years ago because I hoped giving you time would let you grow up. Inta. But all it did was give you a longer runway to run away from who you were. Inta." Julian lowered his head into his hands. A quiet, ragged sob broke from his chest. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't performing. He wasn't managing an impression or calculating an angle. He was just a son sitting on his father's porch, facing the wreckage of his own choices. "What do I do now?" "Dad?" he choked out. "I have nothing left." I walked down the steps, stood beside him, and placed a heavy, calloused hand on his shoulder. "You have a pair of work boots in the back closet," I said quietly. "You have hands that know how to hold a hammer, and you have a father who will stand beside you while you clear the rubble, provided you're ready to dig down to the rock this time." He looked up at me, blinking through tears, and nodded. "I'm ready, Dad. I'm ready." 6 months later, the morning sun came up clear and warm over Hanover County. The news had long since moved on from Aerotech Defense. The company was reorganized under new management, stripped of its defense contracts, and scaled back to a small commercial software outfit. Julian didn't fight the liquidation. He worked with the bankruptcy trustee, signed every document without complaint, and moved into the small guest room above my workshop. Every morning at 6:30, he puts on a pair of work boots and a flannel shirt. He helps me rebuild small engines, haul timber, and maintain the grounds for the local Veterans Trust. He doesn't carry a $4,000 watch anymore. He wears an ordinary steel watch with a leather strap. He speaks less, ma. He listens more, ma. And when old friends from his former life happen to pass through town, he doesn't hide in the back room, ma. He walks out, shakes their hands with grease on his knuckles, and introduces himself as Arthur Miller's son, ma. On a warm Saturday in October, General Marcus Vance drove down from the Pentagon in a nondescript civilian sedan. He didn't wear his dress uniform or 4 silver stars. He wore a simple jacket and a ball cap. We sat on the porch together, drinking black coffee from heavy ceramic mugs, watching Julian in the driveway below, using an engine hoist to lower a rebuilt V8 into a neighbor's farm truck. "He's coming along. Arthur," Marcus said quietly, setting his mug on the railing. "He's getting his hands dirty." "Marcus," I replied, a small, genuine smile touching my face. "That's where the foundation starts." Marcus smiled, looking out over the quiet Virginia woods. "The world is full of men who want to be generals, Arthur. It's rare to find one who remembers how to be a soldier." I looked at my wrist, at the scratched bezel of my old field watch, the watch given to me by men who had stood in the mud with me when everything else was burning down. A man doesn't need a 4-star salute to know what he's worth. He doesn't need a head table or a $5 million contract to sleep well at night. Honor isn't what you claim when the crowd is watching. It's the quiet truth you carry when the lights go down and the room goes still. If a man in your life ever tried to teach you the value of honest labor over cheap applause, what was the one lesson he gave you that you never forgot? Share your story in the comments below.